Well, wherever you're watching from right now, I know you're not here with us in the building, but can we just give it up for the band? They were incredible leading us this morning in songs. And just thinking about that song, Waymaker, that God is our Waymaker, that He's our promise keeper, that He's our light in the darkness. What great reminders for us and for me personally this morning. I love what Grace said, that allow that truth to become a part of our heart today. And I hope that that's same with you as well. And today we are continuing our series we started last week called The Land Between, where we're joining along this journey in the Old Testament and following this story as it also relates to our story. And so today, as you're a part of today's service, there's two things I want to highlight. If you are watching our live broadcast, make sure to join our chat down here. It's a great way for you to be in the conversation with us and also talk to other people. And also there's a section at the bottom to take notes on. So take advantage of both of those things online. It's a great resource for you to stay engaged with the message during this time as we have this conversation together. But as we jump into today, I want to throw out a big question because I think it's a question that we're going to see in our story today, but a question that many of us are wrestling with even right now. And it goes something like this. I think there are times that we're very sure that God is in something. And then I think there are times that we question whether God is in something or not. And so the question I want us to think about and consider today is this. What is it that makes you question if God is in something or not? The question is, what is it what makes you question if God is in something or not? And that's the question I want us to start our time together with today.
Yeah, what a question. I agree with you. There are times where we're sure, and there are times we're not sure, and to think about that. So be thinking about that, and as you're thinking about it, let me just kind of catch you up in our conversation. We started this brand new series last week, this new conversation titled The Land Between, and here was the definition that we use to define what we mean by the land between. In fact, Jeff Mannion describes the land between this way in his book called The Land Between. Here's what he says. He says, the land between is where life is not as it once was and where the future is in question. And you think about just that one statement, that one definition, man, that just so defines where we're all at right now. He goes on, he says, it's where everything normal is interrupted. And again, I think our normal has definitely been interrupted. And then he says the land between is that undesirable space between two desirable spaces. So that's pretty interesting. So all that to say that the land is between is that place that we find ourselves where things aren't the way they used to be, and yet things aren't the way that they're obviously going to be. And so we're stuck there. We find ourselves in between there. And we're looking at what I think is a perfect example in Scripture of a group of people who found themselves in the land between. We're following the Israelites as they leave Egypt and they're on their way to the promised land, a place called Canaan, a place that God had promised that He would lead them to. But they find themselves between the way it used to be and the way that at some point in the future it's going to be. And so they find themselves in this land in between. And we talked about this last week as we began this journey with them and the conversation. We said that every land between begins with a burning bush as we looked at the story of Moses. And really their land between began with a burning bush conversation between God and Moses, where God basically shows up and says, Moses, I'm about to interrupt your life. Your normal is about to be totally turned upside down. And I want you to go to Egypt, and I want you to lead my children Israel out of Egypt, out of slavery, and I want you to lead them to the promised land. And so they begin this journey. And the things that we talked about are highlighted last week that I think are important for us to remember as we jump into this week was this. We had 4 takeaways basically, and they were this. God sees, God hears, God is concerned, and God is with us. Pretty simple things to remember. God sees, God hears, God is concerned, and God is with us. If you're following along, if you looked at the notes that Trey mentioned, you see the verses that we pulled that from last week. That came out of a conversation that God had with Moses as they began this journey. So again, it should be pretty easy for them to learn, something easy for them to remember, but as we're going to see, it was anything but that. They seem to quickly forget those 4 very important promises that God made at the very beginning. In fact, we see that as they begin this journey, it doesn't take them long to forget that at all. They leave Egypt. They've just started their journey. They camp by the Red Sea. One evening, they look up and they realize that the Pharaoh's army has decided not to let them go, and so he's now going to chase them down and bring them back. And they look up and they see the army coming, and they're complaining with Moses, and did you bring us out here to die? And Moses says, just stand still and watch God do what only God can do. And so we know the story. God parts the Red Sea. The Israelites walk across on dry land, and as Pharaoh's army pursues them and takes the same route through the sea collapses on them, and they all drown there in the sea. And so, very quickly they seem to forget this simple promise and reminder that God sees, God hears, God is concerned, and that God is with them.
And I love that, God gives them this promise, tells Moses this, gets the people there. They just saw this great miracle that God had done. They're 3 days into this at this point. And this is where we're going to pick up our story and where it unfolds. So if you have a Bible, you can turn with us. We're going to look at the passages, Exodus 15:22 through 17:7. And we're not going to read this verse by verse because we would be here for hours doing that. But we're going to kind of highlight some of the bigger passages here and walk through this story together and see what happened during these two chapters and how God moved and worked in their lives in this land between, but also how God could be working in our lives in our land between right now, because there is a lot of correlation between their story and our story, as you'll see as we walk through this story. And so, Jeff, you want to kind of pick us up from there?
Yeah, so we're going to pick up in the story in Exodus chapter 15, verse 22. If you've got a Bible, follow along. If not, some of these passages will show up on the screen. But like Trey said, it's only been 3 days since they crossed the Red Sea. And so verse 22, it says this: Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days into the wilderness and then found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Everybody say bitter.
Bitter.
Therefore, thank you for playing along
I got
there.
you.
It says, therefore it was named Marah. In other words, Marah means bitter, and that's why it was defined that way. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And so we've named today, the theme for the day is bittersweet, and you're about to figure out and learn why.
So now I know where all the candy came from. It all makes sense now. All right, let's continue. Verse 25 says this: Then he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. Everybody say sweet.
Sweet.
That was nice. Did you practice that this week?
I
like it.
I was ready for you.
So you think they were just bitter. Everything had just happened with the water there, and then all of a sudden it became sweet. And you'll see that this kind of back and forth, bittersweet, would be their journey over the next few moments together. The bittersweet exchange would take place along this land in between that they find themselves in. And if we were to define sweet, it's those moments where everything is going good. Everything feels right. It feels like there's no worries, no cares. Everything is just sweet. But then you get to those times in life where things are bitter. And this is when things aren't going so well. Things aren't going as well as planned. Things didn't go the way they thought they were going to go. And they find themselves to be bitter. And maybe you've had moments like that too, where you've had these sweet moments and you've had these bitter moments. And that's where we're going to see, as we continue the story, these kind of moments take place in their lives.
Yeah, this really sets up the story really well. The bittersweet of the journey of the land between.
And so as we continue reading this, just look for the ways that this bittersweet takes place. The verse continues, it says, There the Lord issued a ruling, an instruction for them, and put them to the test. He said, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Then they came to Elam, where the 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. So for me, I hear the word camp, and I want to be camping so bad right now. So it's hard to even read that without like cringing. But just think, they had just come from this terrible land. They had just watched this, all these things take place in their lives, and then all of a sudden, things became really sweet. I mean, they were in these palm trees, all this water was there, everything was great. Here's kind of the visual example of what I see when I think about this. I found 2 images this week. Here's one. This is kind of where they came from. This is not only what it looked like, but probably what it felt like inside, what they were dealing with, how life was bitter. And then all of a sudden, God opens up this incredible opportunity for them to be in this new place, which looks something like this. Take a look at this. Palm trees and water in the middle of somewhere where you would not expect these things. And they got to be in this moment going, man, God is so good. Everything's so sweet. Everything's great. Like life is good. But we know that it probably wouldn't continue that way.
Yeah, it didn't stay that long for them. Remember now, they're on a journey. This isn't their permanent place. This isn't where they're going to stay, and so they have to move on from this incredible sweet spot. And so the sweetness doesn't take long before it turns to bitter. So we jump into verse 16. The journey continues. They've left this oasis place. And then verse 2 of 16 says this. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses. Isn't that what we do when things aren't going the way that we think they should? We begin to grumble and complain. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and we ate all the food that we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. And so all that sweetness has now returned to bitterness. I mean, not only are they thirsty, their water supply is running dry or low again, now they're finding themselves hungry and their food supply is in short supply. And so in some ways, you would think, well, they have the right to complain, but this makes them very bitter toward God, obviously.
And then it continues. And what's great about this is it continues, it gets sweet again. In verse 4, it says, then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. How great does that sound, raining bread? The people they go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. And on the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is what will be twice as much as they gather on the other days. And so this story continues. God provides for them, gives them what they need. They rested on the 7th day. I mean, things were really turning up for them again after they were grumbling, complaining. They had what they needed, and things were sweet again at this point.
Yeah, it's also during this time that the Sabbath day is introduced because they're to gather this stuff for 6 days. Now, you talk about this bread. So here's what's really cool when you read about it. This bread, this manna, and it was called manna because they didn't know what it was. And the word manna means we don't know what it is, but manna. It was sweet. In fact, some commentaries say that it was like graham crackers, that it was very sweet. So I could live off of that for a while. Yeah.
Well, you think they got food and they got rest. I mean, they're in a good place right now.
Yeah, so the Sabbath day, they were to gather on the 6th day, they were gathered twice as much, and so that on the next day, they didn't have to worry about gathering anything. They could just sit back and enjoy it. And like you said, life was sweet for them. But again, that doesn't last long. We'll jump over to chapter 17 now, verse 1. It says, so the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin where they were at, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink there either. And so they what? They quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. And they said, why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst? And then then Moses cries out to the Lord, what am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me. So again, it doesn't take long until this sweetness turns bitter once again for them.
And it's so funny. I mean, they just saw God provide for them. They know God has them, but yet they go right back to complaining. And then we see again, God intervenes and it gets sweet again. In verse 5, it says, the Lord answered Moses, go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you will strike the Nile and go. I will stand there before you by the rock of Horeb. Strike the rock, and the water will come out for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. So how sweet is that? All they got to do is go over this thing, strike it, and all of a sudden water comes out. It's kind of like the first Keurig that we see without coffee. I mean, water just pours out, and they're like, sweet, thanks, God. You provided for me once again.
So you should name your Keurig Rock.
Rock.
All you do is push the lever and coffee comes out. Doesn't get any better
I'll
than
just
that,
go over
right?
and just go rock. And just see what happens.
See what happens. Very good. I like that. I'll never forget that picture now.
Yeah.
A Keurig in the desert
Yep.
in the Old Testament. Very good. So,
Israelites Keurig.
so here's the point. As you can see, this pattern continued. It was bittersweet, bittersweet, bittersweet. This would really this would describe their journey for the next 40 years. When things were going well, everything was great. They trusted God. God was in it. But then as soon as things didn't go quite the way that they thought it should, or they began to face their fears or frustrations again, they would become very bitter and begin to blame God and Moses for the circumstances that they had found themselves in, forgetting totally all the incredible sweet things that God had done up until this point in their life. And so it's interesting because as this story kind of comes to an end here at the end of chapter 17, it's almost like Moses names this place the bittersweet. In fact, verse 7, here's what it says. And Moses called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? So this is an interesting deal here, because the two words that Moses chooses to identify this place, the word Massah means testing. And when I think about this whole story and when you read through this passage, there's two tests that are going on. You read it at the very beginning of the story. So God creates this test for them, and not to cause them to fail. We talked about this week. When we're given a test, it's to see how much we retain. How much are we learning? And so they were given these tests almost to see if they would remember that God sees, God hears, God cares, He's concerned, and that God is with them. And so He would always give them these tests to see if they were learning that, and they would in turn test the Lord back. In other words, it was like they would test His patience, because they would very quickly forget those things about God. And so the first thing that Moses does is he names it this place Massah, which means testing, and I relate that to the sweet spots, because when God shows up and does these incredible things in our lives, we refer to that as these sweet moments. We get to see God do what only God can do. But He also names it Meribah, and that word or name means it's complaining or quarrelsome. And I think it identifies the bitter moments that they would have, not because of God not doing what God promised that He would do, but because they would forget, that they would, and for some of us, we kind of think, how in the world could that happen? You go back to the beginning of the story, just hours into their journey. They're camped there, they're resting, they've been set free, they look up, here comes the army, and now they're thinking, okay, God's not, what happened to all this? You brought us out here to die. Now, what you got to remember, what took place before that were the 10 plagues. They got to see God do all of this, and none of them were affected by the plagues themselves, especially the last one, the killing of the firstborn. And so they see all of this take place. They see God work and make Pharaoh set them free, and now they look up, they're about to die. They cross the river. The Pharaoh's army dies in the river. So you would think, man, this is going to be an incredible journey. We're going to get to experience God do what only God can do time and time again. But instead, as long as things were sweet, God was great. But when it was bitter, then God was anything but that to them. In fact, we asked this question at the beginning, Trey did. How do you know if the Lord is in it or not? How do you know if the Lord is in it or not? And then to break that down, what makes you think he is in it, and what makes you think that he's not in it? I just think those are great questions for us to wrestle with as we look at this story.
Well, you could tell they were wrestling with it because, like you said, when things were going good, God was good. Everything was great. Thank you, God. But then when things didn't go their way or things got bitter, they got bitter. They got quarrelsome. They got upset. They were like, God, where are you? Are you in this? And isn't it funny how they did this, but also how we do this as well? I know for me personally, it happens all the time. When things are going great in my life, it's like, man, God is so good. I'm so blessed. I can't believe he would show up and do that for me. But when things aren't going my way, or I didn't get what I want, or things aren't going what I thought were planned, how I get bitter, I get upset, and I start making excuses, and I start wondering, where is God? Doesn't he see me? Doesn't he care? And I know all of us have those moments where we ask those questions, and it's funny how when things are good, we think God's good. But when things are bad, we think something's wrong with God, or we think God doesn't care. And that's not really how God works when we see stories like this.
So you said, it's easy to look at them and think, how could they be such knuckleheads? But the truth of the matter is we're just as much a knucklehead, because I do that. When things are great, I'm like, man, God's obviously in this. Look at what we're doing. We're accomplishing all these things. And then you go through a season where, it's kind of dry. You're not really sure. And then you begin to question, well, maybe God's not in this, And so I look at where we're at now. I look at our country especially. And, you and I have had a lot of conversation about this. We started out with a series, Fear, Not Faith, Faith, Not Fear.
Yeah.
And I watched as it seemed like a lot of churches, a lot of pastors were preaching a similar message and just reminding us that we didn't need to fear, that God had reminded us to trust him. And so you saw people kind of rally around that and go, okay, God is in this, we got this, God's got this. But the longer this goes on, we've moved from faith to frustration. And I watch, just look at the news and watch the way people are protesting and the things they're asking for and the expectations that they have. And so it's like we've gone from trusting God and trusting that God's in it to going, okay, enough of this. We want out of this. It's almost like the Egyptians or the Israelites saying, hey, we'd rather go back to the way it was than to be stuck here where we're at, and totally miss what God is trying to do. So as we think about this, for us as followers of Christ, I think the thing to remember is this, that God is always with us. When I think about this story, when I think about what God was trying to do in their lives, and we're going to see this over the next several weeks as we follow them through this journey, was that God was trying to teach them to trust him. He was trying to teach them that, those four simple things. I see, I'm aware, I've heard your cries. I know what's bothering you. I know what your needs are. I'm just as concerned for you as you are concerned about those things. And then the incredible promise that he is always with us. And if we could just camp there, it would be that oasis. What an incredible picture. That's what it would be like in our, if we could just trust God in those hard times. And so the other thing about this story, as we read in the New Testament even, that everything that happened in the Old Testament was an example for us, something that we could learn from. And so as we find ourselves in the land between, we know that God is with us no matter how bitter or how sweet it is. In fact, here's the simple takeaway that we have for you today, and it's this. Just because it's hard doesn't mean that God's not in it. Just because it's hard doesn't mean that God's not in it. In fact, we learn, all of us do, that it's in those hard moments that we often see God show up and do his best work. God takes those bitter moments and makes them so sweet. And if nothing else about this story and about this journey, especially this part of it today that we're looking at it, may we all be reminded that just because it's hard doesn't mean that God's not in it.
And I think that's what they had to learn on their journey, and I think it's something we're all learning on our journey as well. And so no matter what land between you find yourself in today, whether it's because of what's going on in our world right now, but I know a lot of us have land between moments that we didn't expect, and things aren't going as well as planned, and things we're struggling with in our own land between, in the big land between, like we talked about last week. So whatever that looks like for you, the big thing we got to consider is how will we trust God in these moments? And how will we allow him to be God in the bitter and the sweet? And for me, I was thinking about when this whole thing started a few weeks ago, it was funny how everybody was posting on social media, yeah, I'm trusting God. Yeah, God's got this. He's in control, all this. And it's funny now, you don't see as much of that anymore. You see people complaining. You see people upset. You see people blaming. And kind of what you're talking about, this whole idea of we're shifting from this whole fear to frustration right now. And that's where a lot of us are. We're frustrated with where we're at. And we're frustrated about our circumstances. And I think we can all look back on times in our lives where we were frustrated, things weren't going well, but we got to see God do something different or unique and meet us where we were at. And I know for me, one of those moments when we were talking this week, and when me and you were talking, and also in our small group, one of the questions was, what is the land between we've been through? And my wife and I, a few years ago, when we got pregnant with our first son, I remember how exciting it was when we found out we were pregnant. One, because we didn't know if we'd be able to have kids because of things that we'd heard from doctors and stuff like that, and some of the things that my wife was going through. And so we show up to get our first ultrasound, and we are so excited. We're like that new couple. We're about to have a baby. We have no idea what we're doing. And we go to the first ultrasound, and they're showing us the baby. And all of a sudden, we could see the doctor get really quiet when we were doing the ultrasound. And we're like, what's that about, And so we start wondering in our heads, well, yet we're still really excited. Well, the main doctor comes back in and starts telling us all of these complications that we're going to have over the next few months as we prepare for our first son to be born. And I remember for Kirsten and I how hard that was, because we felt like we got the wind sucked out of our sails, because we were so excited about this. We were so excited to be able to one, have a child, but now we were so frightened by all of these complications that were going to come along the way. And they were. The next few months after that news were tough for us. One, to go through those, but also to trust God in those, because we felt like God had provided us a son, and we're so excited, but yet why would God give us these complications if he's providing us the son? And so over the next few months, we wrestled. We had good days, bad days, but I remember during those times, one, my wife and I got closer than we ever had before, and we both got closer to God than we ever had before. And so we prayed like never before. We trusted God like never before. And after those few months were done and our son was born, and there were complications with the birth, but when he was born, I remember my wife and I just looking down and just saying, thank you, God. And she was on all kind of medicine, so it was really funny the way she was thanking God versus the way I was thanking God, but it was both really good. But it was just such a miracle for us, and we got to see God at work in the bitter and the sweet. And I think for all of us, our lives are like that. No matter what bitter or sweet moment that we're going through, God is in it all. God is there with us all, and he's going to see us through it all. And my dad always talked about in life, you'll experience mountains and valleys. And it's in those moments where I clung to that phrase, because my dad was right. Life is full of these great ups where we get to see God at work, and it's awesome. And then we go down in these valleys where it gets tough, and we're confused, and we're wandering around. But it's in those moments that I feel like we get to see God at work the most. And so one phrase I just want to leave you with today, as I was thinking about today, is we get to enjoy God on the mountaintops. But it's in the valleys we get to see God do what only he can do. We get to enjoy God in the mountaintops, but it's in the valleys we get to see God do what only he can do, and we get to trust him the most in those moments. And so today, as we wrap up everything and we really consider this truth for our lives, no matter what in between we may be facing, there was a song that came out not too long ago called Hills and Valleys. And it explains this dichotomy between these two things and how, in the middle of it, we can see God at work. And so just over the next few moments, I just want you to think about your land between. And I want you to think about how you can find hope and trust in God during this time as the band plays this next song?
No, you're right. That was like the perfect song to bring that all together.
What
that
a
God
great
is
reminder.
perfect. Yeah. So I was looking at this, Dre, and so these are called Sour Patch, and it says sour then sweet. And I thought, for some of us, we find ourselves in a sour patch right now. Maybe coming into today, hearing this message, hearing this conversation, listening to their story, you realize that that's where you've allowed yourself to be. And I want to remind you, as this top corner says, sour then sweet. Allow God to do only what God can do in this sour patch in your life. Allow God to show up and give him permission to do so, and watch God turn that bitter moment into one of the sweetest spots in your life right now. That's the promise that God makes, just like he did for the children of Israel. Time and time again, he would take what was bothering them, he would take their concerns, and he would turn it into a very sweet moment for them.
So would you say that after that we become sweet tarts?
Very good. That works.
You like
sweet
that?
Tarts. We're all a bunch of sweet tarts. So I'm sweet and
I'm kind of tart.
you're kind of tart. So there you go. So.
Well, thanks again for being with us today. And there are some questions we want to throw out to you today to have to work with your family or wherever you're at right now, or just to consider, or also for you to join in on group this week as well. And so here are the questions. The first one is this: describe a bittersweet moment in your life, a moment where things were tough, but you also found this sweetness in it as well. So what's been a bittersweet moment for you?
And then the second question there is, have you ever found yourself questioning God's presence? And if so, why? And the truth of the matter is, we all have. We've all wondered if God was in it. Well, what makes us question that? What makes us ask that question?
And then a question we normally throw out at the end of the service, but I think it's a very important one for us to think about today because it applies it directly to our lives when we hear a story like this, is based on today's conversation. What do you think God is saying to you? What do you think specifically God is trying to say to you right now as you've heard these words today?
Yeah, and we really wanted to, that's not just a throwaway question.
Yeah.
Even for Trey and I, as we were preparing for this week, and we met for several hours, just had our own conversation around this story, we realized that there were so many things that applied to us, that God was speaking into our heart. And we've come to realize and believe that when we have these conversations from the stage with you guys, that there's a message. God has something for every single one of you, and to include us. And so if we would just simply ask that question, okay, God, what is it out of this that I'm supposed to walk away from and work on this week? And so we hope that you will take some time and just, again, be real, because we think God has a word of encouragement for you in this as well. So thanks for joining us this week. Thanks for being a part of this conversation. Don't forget, at each of our campuses between 12 and 1:30,
1:30, yep.
You can get your top secret package. And like I said, I know what's in there. Trey doesn't, but it is incredible.
Definitely
and
worth
that's
it,
all
huh?
I'm going to tell you about
Okay.
that. So
Cool. Well, thanks for being with us today. Hope you have a great week and enjoy the bittersweet.
the bittersweet. God bless you guys. See you next
See you guys
week.
next week.
We hope this message will help you explore, experience, and express God's grace and truth for your life. If Atlee Church has made a difference in your life, or you have questions about today's message, we'd love to hear from you. Simply email us at stories@atleechurch.org. Check out our website for more information about small groups, upcoming events, and how you can help financially support Atlee Church so that we can continue to share messages like this one. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so that you can receive new podcasts every week. You can also find our podcast on iTunes. Thanks again, and hope to see you next Sunday.